What is suffering? Well, suffering is acknowledging the way you feel. And the way I feel about the word suffering is that there are a lot of hidden meanings to it. So if you take the word suffering, you may realize that there are also words like suffocate. And in German, we have a word for it, and it says Leid. Right? We also say Leidenschaft, which means, suffering creates something. But Leidenschaft means passion. And you will often find that passionate people, they also suffer a lot. You have a passion, but you also suffer in a sense to bring this passion into your life. Because sometimes you will have times where you lose bliss, because bliss is somewhat opposed to suffering. And when I look at myself now, and I look at the way I feel, and I look at what I am creating on the outside at a given moment. So suffering can be something that shows in the way you live. So if you're suffering a lot and you're trying to create this kind of, and you're trying to escape this kind of suffering, you may create the suffering on the outside, and then you cling to the feeling that makes you suffer. And that means it would probably show in a messy room, or a messy house, or a lot of things from the past that you cling to. Because you hold on to what you know. So you might have lived your life and had certain experiences that you may label as negative, right? I mean, there's like incredibly intense experiences, such as being beaten up, being spanked, being pushed out by others all the time, being raped. But there are also events in your life that may seem like almost negligible, such as, having received bad grades in school, which is, of course, a form of judgment, right? So people judge you for the work you delivered, and they say, that's bad work. But you delivered it, so how can that be bad, right? Maybe you thought that this is the best you can do. And then if you consider your state of mind, which is that you're suffering, but you still manage to deliver a certain kind of work. I mean, that's something to celebrate rather than to, judge badly. So suffering, to suffocate, right? To suffocate means to kind of, to drown in something. It's like pushing down on you and you're suffocating in it, right? If you're walking into a swamp, you may be suffocated by the swamp. And that means then you have to look on the inside to realize what you are suffering about or what brings your suffering. And these are emotions, because you are an emotional being. You have emotions. whether others might think that these emotions are genuine, or, right, maybe some people think that, or you think that there is no reason to have these emotions, but the emotions are there. And it feels incredibly painful to allow yourself to suffer. So I can speak from my own experience when I say that I've been living in an incredible mess. And for long periods of my life, I thought that this mess was something bad. And because it was something bad, I felt ashamed for the mess that I was creating over and over again in my life. You know, this kind of mess would show itself, or I would project this mess onto the people I lived with, or onto my room, or onto the way I thought about myself. And then I would feel ashamed. And so, with your suffering, which is there and needs to be acknowledged, you know, you create all kinds of other emotions, such as shame, and that means you're basically torturing yourself. Because you say, you know, I am different from what I think I should be, but right now this is how you are. And you may even say this is who you are, because right now this is the state of affairs. You feel bad, you feel terrible, you feel like you are in pain. And you're trying to live your life. But because there is so much suffering inside of you, and you also see that suffering in the outside world, your mind is basically set to only see suffering. So you walk outside the door and maybe the sun is shining, but you see all these people that are incredibly sick, that have like really tense bodies and that are really angry, and they talk to each other in a really angry way. Only you could also see it in a different way. You could see it's a beautiful day, and although people are suffering, they still go about their business. And then suddenly there's a certain beauty to it, something that actually makes you smile. So you saw suffering, which is one side of the coin, but then you also learned to look at the other side of the coin, which says, hey, there's also beauty. Because yes, we do suffer, and yes, we do exploit the planet, and we do all these incredibly bad things, but then you walk around on the internet and you realize, despite all the exploitation, and despite all the war and the death, there's also life. And life wants to mingle. So some people, they suffer and then they shut themselves out from the world because they are literally suffocating in themselves, in the emotional swamp that they live in. So you can stay in that swamp and remain suffocated, or you start freeing yourself from the swamp and you start fighting it to get out of it, and you reach out for all the branches you can find, all the things that you can see, and you pull yourself out of it. And if you do this for a while, you will eventually begin to realize that the swamp is becoming less and less and turns into more like a meadow. And suddenly you have something to stand on. Because these emotions that were heavy and dark and engulfing you, you were engulfed by these emotions, suddenly turn into something less slimy, more pure. And just as a swamp eventually will turn into a meadow, where trees grow on, and then eventually you will have a forest, right? You may create a peaceful environment in yourself if you allow yourself to feel what you are suffering about, what is suffocating you. And for that, of course, we talk about then spirituality. A set of methods that helps you to transform your suffering into something that is bright and shining and lightful. And often it is the people that had a lot of suffering thrust upon them, but that still manage to see the sunshine, or that hear the birds twiddling about in the branches of a tree or a bush, that do all these great things that we admire so. And then, you might think, how do they do this? Why can I not do this? Well, because you stopped fighting. So suffering is a form of depression. It's like a low point in your life. And to get out of this, you have to fight. You have to fight these emotions and do what your heart tells you to do. And that's then intuition. You are in a certain place and you're trying to get out of it. Right? This place is in yourself. It's an emotional state. And you define yourself with suffering. Sometimes you may have moments where you feel good, and then this moment passes. And when the moment passes, you look for it in your mind, only you are afraid to do what is needed to get there again. So some people, they suffer a lot, they feel bad, they feel terrible, and then they take psychedelics, and then they suddenly feel good. And then they keep taking psychedelics, only when they don't take psychedelics, they still feel bad. And that tells you that psychedelics can only show you how you may feel if you put in the work and transform the suffering into the feeling that you felt when you took psychedelics, or when you, maybe you went once for a run and that felt incredibly liberating. But then you are also afraid that next time you run, you might not feel like it. And it may well be so that you won't feel the same way about running every time you run. But then it's a form of practice, to keep practicing, to keep honing your skills that allow you at a certain point that each time you go running, you know how to get to that place. And sometimes it's very confusing because there are so many things that you can do. So what do you do then? Well, you choose. You choose what you feel like doing at any given moment. So right now I started cleaning my room. And in the middle of it, now my carpet is outside because it's a dry day, it's sunny. So I put it outside, I brushed it off, and now I'm sitting in my room. I did some rapé, and now I'm recording this episode because I feel like it. So I can also take my time cleaning. But for a long time, the cleaning was more like a very desperate thing. And I felt like the more I clean, right, the worse it gets, because there was always more stuff. And so I started to stop cleaning my room for a while, until I woke up one day and I said, today I'm going to clean. But in the meantime, I allowed myself to feel all these emotions that I needed to feel. And during these times, I refrained from cleaning the outside world. I left it like this. Why? Because I felt like that. I felt like right now is the time to suffer. And so I suffered. And I went all through these anxieties that were tearing me apart, that were torturing me all the time in the form of thoughts or habits, right? I was stuffing myself with food when I felt like it. But I always had a goal. right? My goal was to stand behind the laptop and work, because that is what I actually wanted to do, because that is what I felt like would help me to create the life that I actually want to live. And so I set a lot of things aside so I could suffer. And when I would feel like I'm tired, I slept. And when I would feel like now I need to eat, I ate. But my goal was to keep myself busy, not to distract myself. But the thing is, if you sit at home and you want to do crochet, you will realize that if you feel heavy, it's incredibly hard to do so. But if you do it anyway, you will eventually hold something in your hands that you created. And so all this artwork and all the content that I've been creating have been created because I know how to suffer. So there would be times I would sit in my room and I would see this incredible mess and I would feel bad. But then I had all these methods suddenly. I knew how to draw because I drew a lot. And that taught me how to make these images, these incredible, beautiful images. Only if I wouldn't have suffered, I wouldn't have been able to create them. And that's when you start to become grateful for suffering. And sometimes I would feel maybe slightly happy, or I would feel good about something I did. And then suddenly the suffering stopped. And then I felt like, but that's my motivation, right? If I don't suffer, how can I be creative? And so I tried to find ways that allowed me to suffer without destroying myself, right? So coffee can create suffering, but it also makes me very toxic. So I would suffer and then drink coffee so that I could make a painting. And then I would keep drinking more and more coffee, and that made me more and more toxic. And then the suffering becomes very angry. But you can also suffer in a kind of loving way, right? In a more peaceful way. And that's when I think there's like a quote in order. It's not an exact quote, I think, but it's something Ram Dass said. And he said that, well, he quoted somebody else, and that person said, "Lord, give me more suffering because it brings me so close to you." And that is true, because when you suffer, you feel. So when you sit around and you're afraid of what you feel, you will push away suffering, and you will watch movies, or you will eat a giant pizza, or you will shout at people because you're trapped in your suffering. And you also do nothing to get out of it. So a method is anything that lifts you out of suffering and into what you may call happiness or bliss or whatever. But in the end, right, when you then use these methods like drinking coffee to stay away from suffering, you never actually suffer. You never actually feel those feelings because you always use things that push these feelings away again from you. So sometimes you really have to sit in the pit. You have to sit in and with your depression and then ask yourself, what do I want to do right now? And maybe all you feel like doing is sleeping, because watching a movie may distract you, but it's also sucking your energy, because it's, it hammers you with all this stuff that is fake, right? I mean, you're watching liars on a screen doing things they never really did, and that's then a fantasy. So you can create a world of fantasy, right, where you tell yourself, oh, everything's good, because, all these kind of things, maybe your father left you and you tell yourself he's still there or whatever, right? I mean, there's all kinds of things. But the truth is your father left you. And so you can work with that by looking at it and asking yourself, how do I feel about it? And then you realize there's so much anger and so much pain. And so sometimes I would lay in my room and I would feel like, "Ugh," right? And then I allowed myself to sleep. And then at one point I woke up and I suddenly had an idea, a vision of what I could do. Record a song, make music in whatever way I want to make music, not how other people make music. Sure, I gathered some of the methods from other people, of course. I looked at how other people make music. Only when I made music, it was different. Right? When I made art, it was different than other people's art. And I kept going and I kept going and I kept going, and suddenly I had hundreds of pieces of art. Suddenly I had hundreds of videos. I had hundreds of episodes. And that all came from suffering. Talking about my emotions and taking my emotions and doing something else with it. So maybe you are afraid of being betrayed or that your partner cheats on you. Well, if you write it down, you can actually look at your feeling, right? If you make an image of how you feel about your partner or about life, suddenly it's out there, right? You used your suffering to create something that others can look at, or that you can look at, and that is beautiful. And maybe in the beginning, your art will be really messy. But the more you do it, the more you learn how to do it and when to do it. And then you can make choices that will get you back to doing it. Because doing and, to keep moving forward, right? When you go hiking, let's say you go for a 5-hour hike. And then maybe the first hour is really nice. And then you've walked one more hour and it's getting a bit of a drag. And then you realize, I'm only halfway now. I still have to keep walking. And so maybe you eat an apple so that you continue to walk. Or you eat nothing and you simply keep walking, and after 5 hours you're back home, and then you eat something and then you realize, oh my God, I managed to go for a 5-hour hike without eating anything. And I felt like it was incredibly suffocating and suffering. It was hard work, and I had to really mentally push through, right? To not just sit down under a tree and, never get up again. But you kept walking and you kept walking. And that's how I felt like for the past couple of years, or most of my life. Only most of my life I had no methods to deal with my suffering and to do something with it. But once I was introduced to, merely the concept of spirituality, I wanted to figure out what I can do to do something. Because I was always waiting for people to help me or to give me a good time. And suddenly I said, I'm gonna give myself a good time. So I stayed alone in my room, and suddenly all these things came out. Images, paintings, songs, all of this stuff, books. And there were times where I felt like writing, and then there were times I felt like drawing, and then there were times I felt like singing, and then there were times I felt like doing all of it at once. And then you think, how is this possible, right? And then you start to question it, how can I do all these things? I mean, shouldn't I be tired? Shouldn't it stop? And then you become afraid and you think, well, it might stop. And then I started to realize that my art will become more angry and more angry if I don't change something again. So I started to change. I changed my diet. I started to work out more. I started to hike more again. I started to go barefoot again. And I realized that as I was changing things on the outside now, also the way I felt about what I do also changed. And suddenly I was more in love, right? Because I had worked out so much of the dark stuff that was suffocating me, that was dragging me down into the swamp. And suddenly I was strong enough mentally and physically, because both of these things go hand in hand, and I could understand what creates suffering, but also what alleviates me from suffering. And so now I can sit here and I can see suffering, but I can also see a path through. I can see what will help me right now to work with my suffering. And so, yeah, sometimes I feel like watching a movie and then I watch a movie. But I watch that movie to understand how I feel about myself. And then I gather insights. I picked that movie for a reason. I don't just watch any movie. I look for one that feels like that's the one, and I settle on it and I watch it until I feel like I've watched enough. And then an idea comes, okay, record a song, do something else, go for a walk. And usually these things, they feel heavy until I've done them. And so the more often you do that, right, it's like weightlifting. I don't do weightlifting, but if you do weightlifting, right, you start with 10 kilos. And then you think, but I want to do 500 kilos. And then you realize, but to get to 500 kilos, you first have to do 10 a couple of times for a while. And then you do 20, and then you do 30, and then you do 40. And that's how it works with suffering, right? In the beginning, suffering and to work through suffering will be incredibly heavy. But the more you do it, the better you become at lifting yourself out of suffering. And then the emotions you feel, they will kind of transform themselves into something else. Whether that is a meal that you cooked, although you hated it while cooking it, well, you still cooked it. And then you can eat it. For me, it started to become, I wanted to be creative. I wanted to be creative and I wanted to go for hikes and I wanted to go outside. And so I stopped relying on other people to make me feel good and I started to make myself feel good. And I did all the things because I suffered. And so to say that suffering is something bad is then a state of ignorance, where you are ignorant of the potential that your suffering gives you. Maybe some people, they don't really suffer, but I think everybody suffers. Only some people, they try to look away from suffering, and I looked at it. And I looked at all the pieces in myself that felt heavy or dirty or dark, and I shone some light on them, because that's what consciousness is. Right? Consciousness and focus is like directing a ray of light onto whatever is hurting in yourself. And so to me, suffering is a way out of suffering. And so when you say, please Lord, give me more suffering because it brings me closer to you, because suffering is something to work with. If I wouldn't suffer, why would I do all these things? Because now it's usually like this. If I feel good now, then I go looking for, something that I can do. And then I suffer. I suffer because I'm searching, I'm going through myself to find something that I can still transform, that I can pick up and look at. And that's an emotion, that's a feeling, that's an experience from the past, that's whatever. And then as you look at these things and you start transforming them, you are actually in the moment. Because you're doing something now. And sitting and watching a movie, you could say that's doing something, but why are you doing it? To look away from things or to look at things? And so, right, suffering is something that's like homework.